Hello, survivors. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it, and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Let's start the story. Some of you might not believe this, but I swear on my badge that every word is true. I've been a game warden in the Blue Ridge Mountains for 17 years. I've tracked poachers through blizzards, pulled lost hikers out of ravines, and faced down charging black bears with nothing but bear spray and steady nerves. Nothing in my career prepared me for this. It started like any other morning. Coffee at 5:30, checking weather reports, loading my gear into the truck. I'd received a tip about illegal bear hunting near Widow's Peak. Some bastards had been setting snares in protected territory. The caller mentioned seeing a group with high-powered rifles and no permits. In my 17 years, I'd arrested dozens of poachers, but bear hunters always got under my skin the worst. These mountains were home to maybe 200 black bears, and every single one mattered. The drive up Forest Road 47 took 40 minutes through winding switchbacks. October mornings in the mountains carry a bite that cuts through your jacket, and the trees were just starting their autumn show. Brilliant reds and golds that tourists pay good money to see. I rolled down the windows to listen for unusual sounds. Gunshots, voices, anything out of place. The forest has its own rhythm, and after all these years, I could detect the smallest disruption. 3 miles past Timber Creek Bridge, I spotted fresh tire tracks veering off onto an old logging road. Deep treads, probably a pickup truck. I radioed dispatch before following the trail. Unit 47 investigating suspicious vehicle activity near Widow's Peak. Possible hunting violation in progress. Dren's voice crackled back through static. Copy that, Clive. Be advised, we've got multiple units responding to incidents in town. Might be delayed on backup if needed. What kind of incidents? Not sure yet. Something about disturbances at the hospital and school. Probably nothing serious. I clicked off, focused on the tracks ahead. The logging road hadn't been used in years, but these prints were fresh. Maybe 6 hours old. Whoever had driven up here had done it before dawn, which meant they were either very dedicated to their illegal hunting or trying to avoid detection. Both possibilities annoyed me. The tracks led uphill for 2 miles before I spotted their camp. I parked my truck a quarter mile away and approached on foot, moving quietly through the underbrush. Standard procedure when dealing with armed poachers. You never knew how they'd react to authority. What I found made my stomach turn. The camp was set up in a small clearing beside Crow's Creek. 3 tents arranged in a triangle, a fire pit with cold ashes, and scattered gear everywhere. But it was what hung between 2 oak trees that made me reach for my radio. A black bear hide, stretched and staked, still dripping blood onto the forest floor. Fresh kill, maybe 12 hours old. Below it, the carcass had been butchered and left to rot. They'd only taken the paws and gallbladder. Trophy hunters and traditional medicine dealers. Son of a bitch, I muttered, photographing the scene with my phone. This bear had been one of mine. I'd tracked this particular female for 3 seasons, watched her raise 2 cubs. The waste of it all made my hands shake with anger, but as I surveyed the camp more carefully, something felt wrong. The tents were still zipped shut, but gear was scattered in all directions. A Coleman lantern lay smashed against a tree trunk. Camping chairs were overturned. A cooler had been torn open, its contents spilled across the ground. Beer cans, sandwich meat, and ice scattered like debris from an explosion. I drew my sidearm and approached the first tent. "Game warden, anyone in there?" Silence. The tent zipper had been ripped open from the inside, the fabric shredded in long tears. I peered through the opening and immediately wished I hadn't. Blood. Lots of it. Soaked into the sleeping bag, splattered across the tent walls, pooled on the floor. But no body. My training kicked in. I backed away from the tent and keyed my radio. "Dispatch Unit 47, I need immediate backup at coordinates." I rattled off the GPS location. Possible homicide scene. Multiple victims suspected. Static answered me. I tried again. Nothing. The second tent was worse. More blood, and this time I found evidence of the struggle. Claw marks gouged deep into the tent poles. but they were wrong somehow. Too regular, too deliberate. Bears don't claw in straight lines like that. These looked almost human. I was examining the marks when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my neck stand up, wet, labored breathing coming from the tree line behind me. I spun around, gun raised, and called out, "This is a game, Warden. Show yourself." The breathing continued, accompanied by a shuffling noise like someone dragging their feet through leaves. I moved toward the sound, weapon ready, using trees for cover. 15 feet into the woods, I found him. He'd been a big man once, probably the leader of this hunting party, based on the expensive gear scattered around him. Now he sat propped against a pine tree, head lolled to one side, breathing in short, desperate gasps. His hunting jacket was torn open, exposing wounds across his chest and arms that looked like bite marks, human bite marks. "Sir, can you hear me?" I approached slowly, holstering my weapon to render aid. "I'm going to help you." That's when he raised his head. His eyes were clouded, but somehow still tracked my movement. His face was pale as paper, lips dark with dried blood. When he opened his mouth, a low moan escaped. Not pain, but something creepy. "Jesus," I whispered, reaching for my radio again. "Dispatch. I need medical assistance immediately. Victim is alive but severely injured. Still nothing but static." The man's breathing had stopped, but his eyes remained locked on mine. For a moment I thought he died. Then he lurched forward with sudden, violent movement. I jumped back as he struggled to his feet. "Sir, stay down. You're injured." He took a step toward me, then another. And those eyes, the look in them wasn't pain or confusion. It was hunger. Pure, mindless hunger. I backed away, hand moving instinctively to my weapon. "Sir, I need you to stop and sit down. Let me help you." He lunged. I'd seen plenty of people in shock, trauma victims who didn't respond normally to commands. But this was different. He moved like a predator, arms reaching for me with desperate intensity. I sidestepped, and he crashed into a tree, bounced off, and immediately oriented on me again. "What the hell is wrong with you?" That's when I noticed his wounds more clearly. The bite marks weren't random. They were concentrated on his arms and shoulders, like someone had been trying to tear chunks of flesh away. And the blood around his mouth wasn't from internal injuries. There were small pieces of something caught between his teeth. I drew my weapon. "Stop right there!" He didn't stop. If anything, the sight of me seemed to excite him. He moved faster, stumbling over roots but never taking his eyes off me. I fired a warning shot into the air. He didn't even flinch. I put 2 rounds. He staggered backward but didn't go down. Dark fluid leaked from the wounds, but he straightened up and kept coming. I fired again, this time aiming for his head. The shot echoed through the mountains, sending birds scattering from the treetops. The man dropped like a sack of grain and didn't move again. I stood there for a full minute, weapon still raised, waiting for him to get back up. When he didn't, I approached cautiously and checked for a pulse. Nothing. But what I saw up close made my blood run cold. His fingernails were torn and bloody, not from the wounds on his body, but from clawing at something, or someone. Under the nails were shreds of fabric and skin that didn't match his own clothing. And his teeth. Christ, his teeth were stained red and had pieces of meat wedged between them. I stumbled backward and vomited into the bushes. 20 minutes later, I'd searched the entire camp. 3 tents, evidence of at least 4 people, but only 1 body. The others were gone, but they'd left a trail even a rookie could follow. Blood drops, broken branches, and footprints heading deeper into the mountains. I tried the radio one more time. Still dead. My cell phone showed no signal. Not unusual this deep in the wilderness. I was on my own, and every instinct I'd developed in 17 years of law enforcement was screaming at me to get out of these mountains immediately. But I was a game warden. These were my mountains, my responsibility. And somewhere out there, 3 people needed help. I loaded extra ammunition, shouldered my pack, and started following the trail. I had no idea I was walking into hell. The trail wasn't hard to follow. 3 sets of footprints, all heading northeast toward the ridgeline. But something was off about the pattern. 2 sets moved in a relatively straight line. The third wandered, zigzagging between trees, sometimes doubling back before continuing forward. Every 50 yards or so I found blood drops. Not a steady flow, but sporadic spatters that suggested someone was bleeding from facial wounds. I'd been tracking for 20 minutes when I heard the first scream. It came from somewhere ahead, maybe a quarter mile up the slope, high-pitched, desperate, and cut short. I broke into a run, abandoning stealth for speed. My boots crashed through fallen leaves as I pushed through dense undergrowth, following the clearest set of tracks. I found the second body at the base of a granite outcropping. This one had been a woman, probably mid-30s, wearing expensive hiking boots and a fleece jacket that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She lay twisted, neck clearly broken from the fall. But the rocks above weren't high enough to cause that kind of damage from a simple slip. I climbed up to investigate. Scuff marks in the dirt, signs of a struggle and more blood. Someone had fought here, fought hard. Deep gouges in the earth showed where boots had scraped for purchase. But there were other marks too. Bare footprints with what looked like claw marks where toenails should be. A sound behind me made me spin around, weapon drawn. Nothing, just wind through the pines. But my skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. I keyed my radio again. Dispatch, Unit 47, second victim located. Adult female, apparent homicide, need immediate assistance and coroner. Static. I tried switching channels, cycling through every frequency. Emergency services, park service, even the highway patrol. Nothing but white noise, and an occasional burst of unintelligible voices too distorted to understand. The remaining tracks led uphill, and I followed them with growing unease. Whatever was happening to these people, it was beyond anything I'd encountered in 17 years of law enforcement. The attack patterns were too savage, too primitive, like something had stripped away every trace of human reasoning and left only base instincts. 30 minutes later, I crested a small rise and saw him. He stood in a clearing below, swaying slightly, back turned to me. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hunter's orange vest that was torn down the back. His arms hung loose at his sides, and his head tilted at an odd angle. Even from 50 yards away, I could see dark stains covering his clothes. "Sir," I called out. "Game Warden, are you injured?" He didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I started down the slope, keeping my weapon ready but not aimed directly at him. "Sir, I need you to turn around slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." That's when he pivoted to face me, and I saw what had been done to him. His face was a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone. One eye was completely gone, the socket dark and weeping. His lower jaw hung loose, connected by strands of muscle and skin. But he was standing, moving. That remaining eye fixed on me with terrible focus. And in that eye I saw nothing human left, just hunger. He lurched forward with sudden violent intent. No coordination, no strategy, just raw, desperate need driving him toward me. I fired twice, center mass, watching the bullets punch through his chest. Dark fluid sprayed from the wounds, but his momentum never slowed. I dove to the right as he crashed past me, rolled, and came up firing again. This time I aimed for his head. The shot echoed through the mountains like thunder, and he dropped face first into the pine needles. I stood there panting, ears ringing, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The man had been mortally wounded. Should have been dead from those facial injuries alone. My hands trembled as I approached the body. Up close, the damage was even worse. His fingernails were torn and bloody, skin and fabric wedged beneath them. His teeth were stained dark red, and when I forced myself to look closer, I found pieces of human flesh caught between his molars. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This man had been eating someone. Recently. I heard voices then, drifting down from higher up the mountain. Multiple voices, but wrong somehow. Wet, gargling sounds that might have been attempts at communication. And underneath it all, a rhythmic noise that made my stomach turn. I climbed toward the sounds, moving as quietly as possible through the dense forest. The voices grew louder, more distinct, though no more comprehensible. It sounded like people trying to speak through mouths full of liquid. I found them in a small depression surrounded by pine trees. 3 figures hunched over something in the center of their circle. They tore at it with their hands and teeth, making satisfied, animalistic noises. One of them looked up as I approached. Another member of the hunting party, his throat torn open, exposing the windpipe beneath. Dark blood covered his chin and jacket. When he saw me, he stood and opened his mouth, releasing a sound somewhere between a moan and a growl. No intelligence behind it, just recognition of potential prey. That's when I saw what they'd been feeding on. The remaining hunter lay spread-eagled in the pine needles, abdomen torn open, intestines pulled out and partially consumed. His face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide and staring. But his chest still rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. He was alive, conscious, aware of what was happening to him. The 3 things feeding on him turned toward me in unison, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. No strategy, no communication between them, just the same terrible hunger driving them all. They shambled forward, hands reaching, mouths hanging open. I emptied my magazine into them. The gunshots cracked across the mountains like breaking bones, sending ravens exploding from the treetops in a panic of black wings. 2 of the creatures dropped immediately. The third, the one with the ruined throat, staggered but remained upright. I reloaded and put 2 more rounds into his skull before he finally collapsed. The silence that followed felt oppressive. I knelt beside the disemboweled man and checked for a pulse. Still there somehow, though his injuries were beyond anything that could be survived. His eyes found my face and his lips moved soundlessly. I leaned closer to hear the whispered words, "Kill me." In 17 years of law enforcement, I'd never faced a choice like this. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but agony and desperate hope. This wasn't a man anymore. It was suffering given form, begging for release. I put my gun to his temple and ended it. The echo of that final shot seemed to hang in the air forever. I sat there in the blood-soaked clearing, trying to understand what I'd witnessed. These people had turned on each other with savage brutality, but they'd continued functioning despite wounds that should have killed them instantly. I tried the radio one more time. This time I caught fragments of a transmission. Emergency broadcast system. If you are receiving this transmission, seek immediate shelter. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Outbreak has spread beyond initial containment zone. The signal faded, but those few words changed everything. This wasn't isolated to a single group of hunters. This was an outbreak. Something that was spreading, something serious enough to warrant emergency broadcasts. I gathered what supplies I could from the bodies. Water, energy bars, a first aid kit. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh tracks leading away from the feeding site. Human footprints, but too wide. Like whoever made them had forgotten how to walk properly. And they were heading in multiple directions through the forest. I had 2 choices. Follow the mountain ridge toward the fire tower, where I might reach someone on the radio, or try to work my way back through the forest to my truck. Both options meant traveling through woods that were no longer empty. I chose to head for higher ground. The climb took me through increasingly dense forest. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches blocking most of the sunlight and casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The silence was odd. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind seemed muted here. An hour into the climb, I smelled smoke. Not the clean scent of a campfire, but something acrid and wrong. Burning fabric mixed with an odor I couldn't quite identify, but that made my stomach clench. I followed the smell through a grove of birch trees and found its source. Another campsite, this one different from the hunter's camp. A single large tent, expensive gear scattered around a cold fire pit. But the scene was wrong in every possible way. The tent had been shredded from the inside. Nylon fabric hanging in ribbons. Dark stains covered the ground around it, spreading outward in patterns that suggested something had been dragged across the forest floor. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Clothing, a camera with a smashed lens, a backpack torn open with its contents spilled. I approached carefully, noting the story the tracks told. 2 people had been here recently. The campsite showed signs of a peaceful setup, chairs arranged around the fire, gear organized neatly. Then something had gone wrong, very wrong. The drag marks led away from the tent in 2 different directions. I followed the clearest trail for about 50 yards before I found what was left of the first camper. He'd been partially consumed, flesh torn from his arms and legs in ragged chunks. But what disturbed me most was the pattern of the wounds. Not animal bites. These were human tooth marks. Someone, or something that had once been someone, had fed on this man while he was still alive. A moan from behind me made me spin around, weapon drawn. She emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, moving fast, middle-aged, wearing hiking clothes that were now torn and bloodstained. Her left arm hung useless at her side, and part of her scalp had been peeled back, exposing the skull beneath. But she was moving, tracking my position with eyes that should have been sightless. When she saw me, she opened her mouth and released a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. I put 2 bullets in her chest. She staggered but kept coming. The 3rd shot took off the top of her skull, and she finally dropped. The gunshots echoed through the forest, and I immediately regretted the noise. In the distance, I could hear rustling, movement from multiple directions, all converging on the sound. Whatever these things were, they were drawn to noise like moths to flame. I ran deeper into the forest, abandoning the trail and crashing through underbrush. Behind me, I could hear them following. The sounds of breaking branches and stumbling footsteps seemed to come from everywhere at once. The forest that had been my sanctuary for 17 years had become a hunting ground, and I was no longer the hunter. I climbed steadily upward, using every trick I'd learned in nearly 2 decades of tracking and wilderness survival. But this was different. I wasn't pursuing someone through familiar territory. I was fleeing from something that didn't tire, didn't give up, and didn't seem to feel pain. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded. Either I'd lost them in the dense forest, or they'd found something else to focus their attention on. Neither possibility gave me much comfort. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when I finally stopped to rest. I found a defensive position between 2 large boulders where I could see the approach from 3 directions. Only then did I allow myself to think about what I'd witnessed. People were turning into something else, something that fed on human flesh and seemed to operate on pure instinct. The emergency broadcast had mentioned an outbreak, which meant this was spreading beyond these isolated campsites. But I still didn't understand what I was dealing with. Some kind of disease, drug contamination, mass psychotic break? Nothing in my experience had prepared me for the reality of human beings who continued to function after sustaining mortal injuries. I tried the radio again, cycling through every frequency I could reach. Most channels were silent. A few carried fragments of transmissions, panicked voices reporting incidents, emergency services overwhelmed, military units being deployed to unknown locations. One transmission came through clearly enough to understand. Recommend immediate evacuation of all civilian personnel from the affected zones. This is not a drill. Seek shelter and await further instructions. Affected zones. Multiple locations. This was bigger than a few isolated incidents in the mountains. I checked my watch. 4:30 p.m. in 2 hours. In sea, it would be dark. I had enough water for another day, maybe 2 if I rationed carefully. But I couldn't stay in these mountains indefinitely. I needed to reach my truck, get to a populated area, find out what was happening. The problem was that everything I'd encountered suggested the populated areas might be even more dangerous than the wilderness. I shouldered my pack and started the descent toward where I'd left my vehicle. The forest around me felt different now. Not the peaceful sanctuary I'd spent my career protecting, but something alien and hostile. Every shadow could hide one of those things. Every sound could be the prelude to another attack. But I was a game warden. These mountains were my responsibility, my home. And somewhere between the horror of what I'd witnessed and the growing certainty that the world was changing in ways I couldn't comprehend, I made a decision. I wasn't running away from this. I was going to find out what was happening, and I was going to survive it, whatever it took. The descent back toward my truck took longer than expected. What should have been a 2-hour hike stretched into 4 as I moved carefully through terrain that no longer felt familiar. Every 50 yards, I stopped to listen, scanning the forest for movement. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in broken shafts, creating a patchwork of shadows that could hide anything. I'd been walking for an hour when I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an undisturbed forest, but something oppressive and wrong. No bird calls, no chittering of squirrels, no buzz of insects. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. In 17 years of working these mountains, I'd never experienced anything like it. The wildlife knew something was wrong. They'd fled or hidden, leaving the woods to whatever was hunting through them. I found the first body 20 minutes later. She'd been a day hiker, probably in her 50s, wearing the kind of expensive outdoor gear that marked her as a weekend warrior from the city. Her body lay beside the trail, partially concealed by fallen leaves. At first glance, it looked like she'd simply collapsed from exhaustion or a heart attack. Then I saw the bite marks. They covered her arms and shoulders, ragged tears in the flesh that had bled heavily before clotting. But these weren't animal bites. The spacing was wrong, the depth inconsistent. Someone had attacked her with their teeth, tearing away chunks of muscle and skin with primitive savagery. What disturbed me most was that she'd clearly tried to fight back. Her fingernails were broken and bloody. Defensive wounds covered her hands and forearms. She'd scratched and clawed at her attacker, probably screaming for help that never came. I knelt beside the body, noting details with the clinical detachment that came from years of investigating hunting accidents and crime scenes. Time of death: maybe 6 hours ago, based on the body temperature and rigor mortis. Cause of death: massive blood loss from multiple bite wounds. But the pattern suggested something I didn't want to accept. Her attacker had been feeding on her while she was still alive. A sound in the bushes behind me made me spin around, weapon drawn. Nothing visible, but I could hear movement. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. I backed away from the body, keeping my gun trained on the source of the noise. What emerged from the undergrowth made my breath catch in my throat. It had been a man once, probably in his 30s, wearing the remnants of a A-shirt that suggested he'd been hiking in completely inappropriate clothes. The shirt was torn and stained with dark fluids. His face was a mask of dried blood. Eyes clouded white, mouth hanging open to reveal teeth stained red. When he spotted me, he released a low moan and shambled forward, arms outstretched, fingers hooked like claws. I put 2 rounds. The bullets punched through his chest, spraying dark fluid across the trees behind him. He staggered but kept coming. The 3rd shot took off half his skull and he finally dropped. The gunshots echoed through the forest like thunder, and immediately I heard answering sounds from multiple directions. Moans, wet breathing noises, the crash of bodies moving through underbrush. I'd announced my presence to everything within a half-mile radius. I ran. The next hour was a nightmare of constant movement through increasingly hostile terrain. Every time I thought I'd lost them, I'd hear that telltale sound of pursuit. I used every trick I'd learned in nearly 2 decades of wilderness survival. Stream crossings to break scent trails, rocky ground to avoid leaving tracks, dense thickets that would slow down pursuers. But these things weren't following normal tracking patterns. They seemed drawn to movement and sound rather than scent, converging on my location whenever I made noise. The forest I'd spent my career protecting had become a maze of death. Every familiar landmark now represented potential danger. The old oak where I'd once rescued a stranded hiker could hide one of those creatures. The creek where I'd taught scout groups about water safety might conceal something feeding on the remains of another victim. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand the scope of what was happening. This wasn't isolated to the hunting party I'd originally been investigating. People throughout these mountains, hikers, campers, maybe even some of my fellow rangers, had been infected by whatever was causing this madness. But infected with what? Nothing in my training had prepared me for people who continued functioning after sustaining mortal injuries. The emergency broadcasts had mentioned an outbreak, but they'd provided no details about the nature of the disease or how it spread. All I knew for certain was that human beings were turning into something else, something that fed on the living with an hunger that transcended death itself. I was still pondering this when I finally reached the area where I'd parked my truck. The logging road stretched ahead of me, empty and peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. My vehicle sat exactly where I'd left it, undisturbed and normal looking among the trees. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe I could get out of these mountains, reach civilization, find someone who understood what was happening. Then I saw the figure standing beside my truck. He was leaning against the driver's side door, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms. One of the original poachers I'd been tracking, though he looked like he'd been through hell. His hunting jacket was torn and blood-stained, his face pale and drawn. A crude bandage wrapped around his left forearm was soaked through with dark fluid. He looked up as I approached, and I saw recognition in his eyes. Not the blank hunger I'd witnessed in the others, but genuine human intelligence. Still functioning, still thinking. But there was something else there too. Desperation mixed with fever. "Game Warden," he said, his voice hoarse. "Figured you'd be back for your truck eventually. Been waiting here a while." I kept my weapon ready but not aimed directly at him. "Sir, I need you to put down that rifle and step away from the vehicle." He laughed, a sound with no humor in it. The laugh turned into a wet cough that brought up dark fluid. "Step away? You think I'm worried about getting arrested right now? Look around, man. What happened to your group?" His face crumpled. Adrian Polly from down in Millfield. Guy I've known since high school, been hunting with for 15 years. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of blood. Adrian was sick when we came up here. Had some kind of fever, acting real strange. We should have called it off, should have taken him to see a doctor. But Adrian insisted he was fine, said the mountain air would help. When did he get sick? 3 days ago. Started with flu symptoms. Then he got different. Aggressive, paranoid. Kept talking about being hungry all the time, but wouldn't eat anything we offered him. The hunter's grip tightened on his rifle. We figured it was just the fever talking. I edged closer, noting how he swayed on his feet. The bandage on his arm was coming loose. Deep puncture wounds visible beneath the blood-soaked fabric. "What happened on your first night up here?" "We set up camp like always. Adrian seemed better, more like himself. We thought maybe he was getting over whatever bug he'd picked up." He paused to cough again, more blood coming up. Around 3 in the morning, Brandon started screaming. Found Adrian on top of him, trying to bite chunks out of his neck. "How did you stop him?" "Took all 3 of us to pull Adrian off. He was like a wild animal, clawing and biting at anything that got close. Stronger than he'd ever been. And his eyes were completely white. But somehow he could still see us." He shuddered. "We had to kill him, my friend of 15 years, and we had to put him down like a rabid dog. Shot him 3 times before he stopped moving." But that wasn't the end of it, was it? Adrian got back up. His voice dropped to a whisper. "We'd covered him with a tarp. Figured we'd deal with the authorities when we got back down the mountain. Then an hour later we heard movement. Found him standing over Brandon's sleeping bag, completely upright, those bullet holes still weeping blood. The rifle wavered in his grip. How do you explain that, Warden? How do you kill something that's already dead? We tried to run after that, he continued, his voice getting weaker. Brandon made it maybe 50 yards before Adrian caught him. Heard him screaming for what felt like hours. When we found them, Brandon was still alive, but Adrian was feeding on him, just tearing chunks of flesh away. What about the third member of your group? Gavin lasted until this morning. But the thing is, Brandon got back up too, just like Adrian did. Both of them hunting through the woods like a pack. His breathing was becoming ragged. Gavin got cornered between them. I heard the gunshots, then the screaming stopped. And you? I ran. Left my friends to die and ran like a coward. Tears mixed with the blood on his face. But Adrian caught up with me this morning. That's when I got bit. Managed to put him down again, headshot this time. But the damage was done. He glanced down at the wound, his face gray. Adrian got me when we were trying to restrain him. Tore right through my hunting jacket with his teeth. Bit down so hard I thought he was going to take my whole arm off. I could see the infection taking hold of him in real time. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, dark veins becoming visible beneath the surface. The bandage was completely soaked through, dark fluid dripping steadily onto the ground. "Sir, you need medical attention. Let me help you get to a hospital." He raised the rifle then, pointing it directly at my chest. "No hospitals, no doctors. I've heard the radio chatter before our equipment got destroyed. Hospitals are death traps now." His voice was getting more slurred. "I just need to get out of these mountains. Find somewhere safe. This is my vehicle. I can't let you take it. Watch me." His finger moved to the trigger. "I've got nothing left to lose, Warden. My hunting partners are dead. Really dead this time after I put bullets through their skulls. I'm infected with whatever turned them into monsters." I could see the fever burning in his eyes now. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air, and his hands shook with muscle spasms. "How long ago were you bitten?" "This morning, maybe 6 hours ago." He wiped his face with his free hand, leaving a fresh smear of blood. "Feels like liquid fire in my veins. Everything tastes like copper. And God help me, I'm so hungry I could eat anything that moves." "Listen to me," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I've seen what this infection does to people. You don't want to be behind the wheel when it takes full hold. You'll hurt innocent people." "Innocent people?" He laughed bitterly. "There are no innocent people anymore, Warden. Just the infected and the soon-to-be infected. All the more reason to work together. We can help each other survive this." "Survive?" He stared at me with fevered eyes that were starting to cloud over. "Look at me, Warden. Really look. You think there's any surviving this?" His breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a wet rattle. He was dying. And when he died, he'd become something else entirely. "Step away from the truck," I said, raising my weapon. "Can't do that." He swung the rifle toward me with increasingly unsteady movements. "Sorry, Warden, but I'm taking your ride." The standoff stretched between us, two armed men in a rapidly darkening forest. "You shoot me, you'll bring every one of those things in a mile radius down on this location," I said. "Maybe, but I'll be long gone before they get here." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Step aside, Warden. Last warning." I could see the calculation in his fevered eyes. He was weighing his chances, deciding whether to pull that trigger. In his infected state, his judgment was compromised, but desperation was making him focused in a way that was almost more dangerous than the mindless hunger I'd seen in the others. "You really think you can drive in your condition? Look at your hands." He glanced down at his shaking hands, and for a moment uncertainty flickered in his eyes. That moment of distraction was all I needed. That's when we heard the sound. A deep, huffing breath from somewhere in the forest behind us. Both of us froze, weapons forgotten as something large moved through the underbrush. Branches snapped under tremendous weight, and the sound grew closer. The black bear emerged from the tree line like a force of nature. She was massive, probably 400 pounds of muscle and fur and ancient wisdom. I recognized her immediately. One of the breeding females I'd been monitoring for years, the mother of countless cubs that had grown up in these mountains. She moved with the confident grace of an apex predator in her own territory. But she wasn't hunting. She was angry. The infected hunter spun toward her, raising his rifle with shaking hands. "Jesus Christ, what else can go wrong today?" "Don't shoot!" I shouted. "She's not..." He fired. The shot went wide, the bullet striking a tree trunk 5 feet to the bear's left. In his weakened state, he couldn't control the recoil, and the rifle nearly slipped from his grasp. The bear's response was immediate and devastating. She charged with the explosive speed that made black bears one of the most dangerous animals in North America. The hunter had time for one terrified scream before 400 pounds of fury slammed into him, driving him to the ground with bone-crushing force. What followed was brief and brutal. The bear's claws, designed for tearing apart logs to find grubs, made short work of human flesh. The hunter's screams cut off abruptly as massive jaws closed around his throat. I stood frozen, weapon raised but knowing better than to interfere. This was nature asserting its dominance over the chaos that had invaded its domain. The bear was doing what bears do, eliminating a threat to her territory. But then something extraordinary happened. The bear looked up from her kill and made direct eye contact with me. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the blood-soaked ground. I saw recognition in her eyes, not the blank aggression of a wild animal, but something deeper. Something that suggested she knew who I was, what I'd spent my career doing in these mountains. I'd protected her cubs from poachers. I'd ensured her feeding grounds remained undisturbed. I'd fought to preserve the wilderness that was her home. And somehow, in whatever passes for thought in a bear's mind, she remembered. She huffed once, a sound that seemed almost like acknowledgement, then turned and padded back into the forest. Within seconds, she disappeared among the trees as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. A wild bear had killed an infected human, then spared me. In 17 years of wildlife management, I'd never seen anything like it. The hunter's body lay motionless beside my truck, torn open in ways that ensured he wouldn't be getting back up. Whatever infection had been spreading through his system, it had died with him. The bear had done what I might have been forced to do myself in another few minutes. I approached my truck carefully, stepping around the spreading pool of blood. The keys were still in my pocket, the vehicle undamaged despite the violence that had just occurred beside it. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, hands shaking with adrenaline and delayed shock. The radio crackled to life as I turned the key. Any units in the Blue Ridge sector, this is Ranger Station 7. We have multiple civilian casualties at the Whitmore Creek campground. Request immediate assistance. Repeat, requesting immediate backup for rescue operations. I grabbed the handset, relief flooding through me at the sound of another human voice. Ranger Station 7, this is Game Warden Unit 47. I copy your transmission. Static filled the cab for several seconds before the voice returned, clearer now. Unit 47, thank God. What's your status? We've been trying to reach you for hours. I'm mobile and uninjured. What's the situation at Whitmore Creek? Unknown number of civilians trapped in the campground. We've lost contact with the first response team that went in this morning. Something's got them pinned down in there and we're getting reports of… The voice paused, as if the speaker was struggling to find the right words. We're getting reports of extreme violence, people attacking each other. It doesn't make sense. It made perfect sense to me now. The infection had spread beyond the isolated hunting parties and individual campers. It had reached one of the largest recreational areas in my sector, where hundreds of people might be trapped with nowhere to run. I understand the situation, I said. I've encountered similar incidents in my area. Are you coordinating with state and federal agencies? Negative. Communication systems are down across most of the region. We're operating blind here. How soon can you reach the campground? I checked my watch. 5:30 p.m. Whitmore Creek was 20 miles away by mountain roads, maybe 40 minutes if I pushed the truck. But it would be getting dark soon, and I had no idea what I'd find when I got there. En route in 30 minutes. Be advised, this situation is not what it appears to be. The affected individuals are extremely dangerous and should be considered hostile. Copy that. Unit 47. We'll brief you on arrival. Station 7 out. I hung up the handset and stared through the windshield at the forest that had been my home for 17 years. Everything had changed in the space of 12 hours. The mountains I'd sworn to protect had become a hunting ground for something that defied explanation. The people I'd dedicated my career to helping were turning into predators that fed on the living. But somewhere ahead, at Whitmore Creek, there were still people who needed help. Families trapped in a nightmare they couldn't understand, waiting for someone to rescue them from horrors beyond their imagination. I was a game warden. It was my job to protect these mountains and everyone in them. I put the truck in gear and started driving toward whatever hell was waiting for me at the campground. The radio chattered with emergency transmissions as I navigated the winding mountain roads. Fragments of reports from across the region painted a picture of widespread chaos. Medical facilities overwhelmed, Military units requesting backup, entire towns going dark, but none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the mission ahead. People were trapped and dying, and I was the only help they were going to get. I drove through the gathering darkness, headlights cutting through shadows that seemed deeper and more threatening than they'd ever been before. Behind me, the mountains held their secrets. Ahead, the unknown waited. Whatever was happening to our world, it was just beginning, and I was driving straight into the heart of it.